Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Financial Investigation Agency's webinar on AML, CFT, CPF for jewelers, precious metal, and stone dealers. My name is Demoji Hughes. I am the Outreach Officer at the agency, and with me today to facilitate this webinar is Natasha Jarvis and Siobhan Hunt, who are outreach examiners. Now, today's webinar has been designed to focus on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation, specifically for jewelers, precious metal, and stone dealers. We will focus mainly on the legislative requirements each entity in this sector is required to meet and provide details on what you can do to meet these requirements to ensure your business is compliant. Now, we understand that you may have questions throughout the presentation. So if you can utilize the question box with any questions that you may have, we'll be happy to answer them for you at the end of the presentation. So without any further delay, I'll ask Ms. Jarvis to begin the presentation.
Good morning once again. Okay, before we can understand the terms anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation, we first need to examine what money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing is. So what is money laundering? Money laundering is the act of concealing, retaining, converting, transferring, or in any other way, moving funds acquired directly or indirectly from unlawful activities or otherwise from an unlawful source. Money laundering is effectively the process of integrating the illegal proceeds of crimes. This can be from any crime into the legitimate financial system by hiding or concealing its true origin. Basically, criminals want to hide the fact that their money comes from illegal activity in order to get their money into the financial system. If they are known criminals, they may even try to hide the fact that the money is theirs. There are 3 stages in the money laundering process, which are placement, where money is entered into the financial system, layering, where these illegal funds are disguised by layering the funds using various transactions or shell companies with the intent to hide who the ultimate beneficial owner is, and integration, where the monies are now cleaned and are reintroduced into the economy or to use as legitimate funds. Terrorist financing. Terrorist financing is the provision or use of funds for the purposes of terrorism, or the acquisition, possession, concealment, conversion, or transfer of funds that are directly or indirectly intended to be provided or used for the purposes of terrorism. In essence, terrorist financing is the use of funds or making available funds for the purposes of terrorist activities. It can include the giving of any type of assistance to help further, sponsor, promote, or facilitate terrorism or terrorist activities, from providing funds to buying weapons, providing training or assistance to shelter or buy clothes or transportation for terrorists, or even facilitating so that terrorists can broadcast or hand out leaflets to promote their terrorist ideologies. A key point here to note is the difference between money laundering and terrorist financing. For money laundering, the money usually originates from criminal sources. However, for terrorist financing, it can also be from criminals or legitimate sources. With terrorist financing, it is not necessarily about where the money came from, but more about where the money is going and hiding the purpose for which it is intended to be used. Another way of looking at it is the stages in which terrorism is funded. First, there is the raising of funds through the use of charities, legitimate businesses, self-funding, and illegal activities. Then there is the transferring of funds to wherever the intended terrorist activity is likely to be. Lastly, there is the using of funds, for example, for the purchasing of weapons or to provide training and housing for persons who are a part of a terrorist organization. There are three stages which proliferation financing may occur. Raising funds, just like terrorist financing, this can occur by both legitimate and illegitimate source of funds. Disguising the funds are transferred into the international financial system. Procurement of materials and technology. At this stage, funds that were placed into the international financial system are now used to pay for things like material, technology, and logistics needed to create these weapons of mass destruction. Now that we have looked at the definition of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, let's look at what is referred to as the anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism and proliferation regime. Because of financial crimes such as money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, several countries have been required to implement an anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation regime. The purpose for this regime is to allow countries and those sectors most vulnerable to be at risk of abuse. Most vulnerable to be at risk for abuse to be able to establish and implement policies, processes, and procedures to forestall and combat these financial crimes. The BVI has put in place a legislative framework to fight money laundering, terrorist financing, that has incorporated or adopted international standards and recommendations. This legislative framework includes legislations and guidelines for supervised entities. It also includes the establishment of supervised bodies to monitor and ensure that the laws and standards are being adhered to. Let's look at some of the key legislations as well as the supervisory bodies responsible for ensuring that supervised entities adhere to these legislations. As mentioned previously, in an effort to combat financial crimes such as money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, the BVI has implemented several legislations to aid in the fight against these financial crimes. These legislations include Proceeds of Criminal Conduct Act of 1997 as amended, Anti-Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Code of Practice 2008 as amended, Anti-Money Laundering Regulations 2008 as amended, Drug Trafficking Offences Act 1992 as amended, Proliferation Financing Prohibition Act 2021, Terrorism United Nations Measures Overseas Territories Orders 2001, Anti-Terrorism Financial and Other Measures Overseas Territories Orders 2002, Countering Terrorism Act 2021, Financial Investigation Act 2003 as amended. These legislations are crucial tools that provide guidance to assist all supervised entities with establishing internal controls to combat ML, TF, and PF. In the BVI, there are two agencies that are responsible for supervising businesses for money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing purposes. The Financial Services Commission, FSC, who supervises and monitors financial institutions such as banks, trust and corporate services, and money services businesses. The other is the Financial Investigation Agency, who supervises and monitors DNFBPs such as real estate agents, lawyers, accountants, high-value good dealers, as well as nonprofit organizations. As our focuses would be on jewelers, precious metals and stone dealers, which are considered DNFBP, it should be noted that persons in this sector are supervised by the Financial Investigation Agency, specifically the Supervision and Enforcement Unit of the agency. The Supervision and Enforcement Unit is responsible for supervision and compliance. However, there is another section of the agency, which is the FIU, and that area is where all suspicious transaction reports are sent to be analyzed and disseminated. Now that we have discussed the purpose of the AML, CFT, CPF regime, and the bodies in charge of ensuring that these regimes are followed, let's look at how it is applied to the jewelers, precious metals, and stone sector. Firstly, let's look at what exactly is a jewelry, precious metal, and stones dealer. Let's first define the terms jewelry and precious metals and stone. Jewelry can either be finished or unfinished and includes the sale of raw materials, finings, and precious gems. It can also include objects made of precious metals, precious stones, or pearls intended for personal adornment, such as earrings, bracelets, rings, necklaces, brooches, watches, etc. Precious metals include gold, silver, palladium, right, or platinum, which includes coins, bars, ingots, granules, or in any other similar forms. A precious stone includes diamond, sapphire, emeralds, tanzanite, and rubies. In the AML regulations 2008 as amended, under the terms relevant business, a jewelry, precious metal or stone dealer falls under AML, CFT, CPF supervision if the business is engaged in the sale or purchase of jewelry and or precious metals or stones when involved in accepting cash payment of $15,000 or more. It should be noted that cash in this instance does not only refer to paper money, but it refers to other forms of monetary instrument that does not require the individual or business to receive financing from the bank. For example, checks, wire transfer, debit card payments, etc. If your business meets the definition outlined here, then your business falls under the agency's supervision as a DNFBP carrying out business as a jewelry, precious metals and stone dealer. It is important to note that businesses that deal in precious metals and stones, those specifically identified in the AML regs as undertaking relevant business, should include jewelry, precious metals, and stone dealers, are generally not required to obtain evidence of the identity of the customer in circumstances where the transaction is a one-off transaction and the amount to be paid by the customer is less than $10,000, or the equivalent amount is in another currency. This exemption, however, only applies where the transaction is not linked to one or more other transactions, and the total amount of the transaction is less than $10,000. The exemption will also not apply if you have reasonable grounds to believe or suspect that the customer may be involved in money laundering or terrorist financing. So moving on, why is the implementation of an AML, CFT, CPF regime important for jewelers, precious metal and stone dealers? One, money launderers have used financial institutions and the NFBP to help further their criminal activities by getting their criminal proceeds to look like they are legal and a normal part of the financial system. The NFBPs, for example, jewelry and precious metal and stone dealers are a type of non-financial institution that have been known as having a higher risk of money laundering due to the nature of their businesses or services. Two, also, since money launderers often have a lot of cash that they must try to get integrated into the financial system to conceal its true origin, they often buy high-valued, expensive goods, including jewelries and or precious metals and stones. Once a money launderer buys these jewelry from businesses that sell such items, a money launderer would be able to resell the jewelry, precious metals and stones, or even keep them with little to no evidence that the items or the money from the sales ever originally came from criminals or illegal activities. In addition, criminals may also use jewelry and or precious metals and stones to obtain money from terrorism financing and proliferation finance purposes. For these reasons mentioned, plus several others, the BVI legislation requires a jewelry, precious metals and stone dealer to establish and maintain a written and effective system of internal controls, policies, processes, and procedures that focuses on ML, TF, and PF prevention. They are required to conduct an institutional and customer risk, undertake the appropriate level of due diligence, appoint a money laundering reporting officer, report suspicious activities or attempted activities or transactions, maintain effective records, provide the appropriate level of staff training on AML, CFT, CPF matters. These obligations are required. These obligations are explained in detail in the Anti-Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Code of Practice 2008 as amended. For the remainder of this presentation, we will go through these obligations in more detail and see how they further apply to persons operating businesses in jewelry, precious metals, and stone sector. Section 11 of the AML Code requires that an entity or professional establish and maintain a written and effective system of internal controls as it relates to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. What are internal controls? These are a group of policies, processes, and procedures that a business implements to forestall and prevent any potential risk of ML, TF, PF, or any other financial crime from occurring within their business. The internal controls are often referred to as a company's compliance manual. The purpose for establishing a written system of internal controls are to effectively identify, assess, and understand the ML, TF, PF risk to which a business is exposed to be able to have policies, processes, and procedures in place to manage and mitigate any risk the business identifies, as well as any risk identified by the competent authorities, supervisory bodies, law enforcement agencies, or the National Risk Assessment. It is noted that if you have not familiarized yourself with the last National Risk Assessment that came out of the BVI, please be sure to view this document, which can be found on the agency's website. Another reason why establishing written and effective internal controls are important is because it allows businesses to be able to apply enhanced measures to manage and mitigate higher risk individuals or situations. So what should your business compliance manual include? It should focus on the operations of the business and include what sort of products and services the business offers, what transactions the business engages in, what sort of customers they have, where are these customers from, or what countries are these transactions carried out in, and the delivery channel used by the businesses. It should also include the business's policies, processes, and procedures as it relates to conducting both an institutional risk assessment as well as the customer's risk assessment. It should have details on the person designated by the business to carry out AML, CFT, CPF requirements. In most cases, this would be the business's AML. It should outline any measures the business has for maintaining records as well as for training staff. It should also have policies and procedures for conducting customer due diligence and outline any additional controls they might have as it relates to high-risk customers, transactions, and products or services. This is just to name a few. But for more information of what should be included in your business's compliance manual, we urge you to review Section 11 of the AML Code as mentioned. I now turn you over to my colleague, Siobhan, who will give you more information.
Thank you. So let's look at conducting risk assessments. As a jewelry, precious metal, and stone dealer, when seeking to conduct transactions, you must first assess your business's risk exposure to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. This is done by examining your business's activities, objectives, services, clients, and transactions, and considering what level of money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing risk each category may pose to your business. Section 12 of the code requires that the DNSBP carry out two types of risk assessment. The first is institutional risk assessment. This is an assessment of the overall business of the entity, which would include an assessment of all relevant factors, such as the business's customers, products, services, transactions, or delivery channels. The second is client customer risk assessment. This is an assessment of each applicant for business or customer, including any beneficial owners. The purpose of conducting these risk assessments is to determine the existence of any risk, to determine how best to manage and mitigate the risk identified, to develop, establish, and maintain appropriate AML, CFT, CPF systems and controls to respond to the identified risk, and to ensure full compliance with the requirements outlined in the AML, CFT, CPF legislations. The AML Code further requires that jewelers, precious metal, and stone dealers, in addition to conducting both an institutional as well as a customer risk assessment, document and maintain a record of these assessments. They should also ensure that all relevant risk factors are considered before determining what level of risk the institution faces or the customer poses to the business. For example, as a business, you might determine that your business risk is low because you do not deal with high-risk customers. However, in terms of geographic locations, you do engage in business with persons residing in high-risk jurisdictions. Based on this example, it does not appear as though you have taken the entire picture into consideration. So as previously mentioned, it is required that you examine all areas of risk before you make a complete decision regarding the level of risk exposure. The The AML code also requires jewelers, precious metal and stone dealers to apply the appropriate risk mitigation measures, regularly review and update their risk assessments both for the business and the customer on an ongoing basis, and have mechanisms in place to provide assessments upon request to the agency or any other supervisory body. So looking further at conducting a risk assessment, the chart above provides a few examples of what questions a business, and in this instance, a jewelry or precious metal and stone dealer, may ask to determine the level of risk for various areas or aspects of their business. So on the customer risk, you may ask, what type of customers do I deal with the most? Is the beneficial ownership structure clearly identified? For products, services, transaction risk, you may ask, what is the nature, scale, or diversity of my business's products and services? Does the products or services my business offer include new technologies? Under country risk, where does the business operate from or engage in business? What countries are the business's transactions coming from or going to? Under delivery channel risk, you may ask, does the business relationship involve intermediaries or third-party clients? Does my business have mechanism in place to mitigate any delivery channel risk? So performing a risk assessment is crucial because without this step, the business will not be in a position to identify the business's most vulnerable areas as it relates to money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing, and will be unable to determine the level of risk their products, services, and clients may bring to their business. So conducting a risk assessment on both the business as well as the customer is an important step and should not be neglected when establishing the business's internal controls. So appointing a money laundering reporting officer. Section 16 of the AML code requires a jewelry, precious metal, and stone dealer to appoint a money laundering reporting officer, in short, MLRO. This person should have sufficient seniority in accordance with Section 13 of the AML Regulation 2008 as amended. And some of these requirements mentioned under these legislations states that the MLRO must have a clear understanding of the activities and customers of the business. In simple terms, this person must know the ins and outs of the business. The person should hold a senior position within the business and should be fit and proper to hold the post. They should have the appropriate qualifications. For these qualifications, the AML regulations have outlined them in great detail. Please review this section accordingly. They must have a working knowledge of BVI, AML, CFT, CPF laws, as well as AML, CFT, CPF matters. Their duties should be independent from that of others. It is not recommended for the MLRO to carry out multiple roles within the business. They should also be able to communicate and report to the board of directors within the business and to the agency. So let's look at conducting customer due diligence. This is another obligation which is essential to a good AML, CFT, CPF regime. So what exactly is customer due diligence? Customer due diligence is the process of getting to know your customer. This is done by collecting all relevant data and information that can be used to aid your business in getting to know the persons you are entering into a business relationship or one-off transaction. Section 19 of the AML code requires an entity or professional to conduct CDD in instances when establishing a business relationship, when effecting a one-off transaction, when there is a suspicion of money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing, when a business or transaction presents a higher risk, and when a business may have doubts concerning the veracity or adequacy of information received from an applicant for business or customer. So what is required when seeking to conduct customer due diligence? A business must inquire and identify the applicant for business or intended customer and verify their identity, obtain information on the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship, use reliable evidence through inquiries as necessary to verify the identity of the applicant for business or customer, utilize measures to obtain information on the applicant for business or customer source of wealth and funds, size of business and nature of the transaction, conduct ongoing monitoring on business relationships and transactions undertaken, as well as to identify and verify the identity of a person acting or who purports to act on behalf of an applicant for business or a customer. So let us examine in more detail the various types of customer due diligence a business will be required to perform. The AML code mentions 3 types of due diligence a business can carry out. This includes simplified due diligence, standard customer due diligence, and enhanced due diligence. Simplified due diligence is the lowest level of customer due diligence that can be conducted on an applicant for business or professional that poses a low risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing. In simplified due diligence, the applicant for business or customer poses a lower risk than a customer in the standard due diligence category, and a far lesser risk than customers in the enhanced due diligence category. With simplified due diligence, the AML code makes mention of instances where a business may consider an applicant for business or customer may be of low risk, and some of these include a source of fixed income, publicly listed companies subject to regulatory disclosure requirements, or government statutory bodies. In carrying out standard customer due diligence, a business must identify the applicant for business or customer. This entails gathering and recording information about the applicant for business or customer to establish who the applicant for business or customer is. Information that must be gathered and recorded may differ based on whether the customer is an individual, legal person, or a legal arrangement. The business must verify the applicant for business or customer's identity. This entails gathering evidence via reliable and independent information, data, and/or documentation to confirm that the customer is who he, she, or it says it is, and authenticate that the identification information provided is a true and accurate copy. The business must obtain details of the purpose or intended nature of the business relationship or transactions. This requires an entity or professional to establish the reason why a customer is seeking to establish a business relationship or conduct a one-off transaction. The entity must understand the applicant for business or customer and their circumstances. In understanding the applicant for business or customer and its or his or her circumstances, information that should be collected would include the nature and details of the person's occupation or employment, the nature or details of their business activities, assets held or managed or to be held or managed, the anticipated level and nature of activity to be undertaken throughout the business relationship, the applicant for business or customer source of funds or wealth, the countries with which they intend to engage or have connections, whether the applicant for business or customer has any criminal record or is a known associate of criminal or criminal organizations, and whether the applicant for business or customer is a pet, amongst other things. For enhanced due diligence, this is to be performed on an applicant for business, customer, or transaction that presents a higher than normal risk. For these situations, along with collecting standard CDD information, an entity or professional is required to obtain additional information on the applicant for business or customer. They are required to undertake further research where necessary, obtain additional information on the source of funds or wealth of the applicant for business or customer, and verify this information along with obtaining the approval of senior management to commence or continue the business relationship, amongst other things mentioned in the AML code. Reporting a suspicion. Another requirement outlined in the AML code is the requirement to report a suspicion. Section 18 of the code mentions that an employee is required to report a suspicious activity or transaction to the money laundering reporting officer. This should be in a form established by the business as part of its internal controls, or as the commission or the agency may approve in writing, provided that the report complies with the requirements outlined in Section 55 of the code. This report should provide details of the information giving rise to any knowledge or reasonable grounds for the suspicion held, including the full details of the customer, such as their name, date of birth, or in relation to a company, the date of incorporation, or formation, and its address. Section 18 also requires a report to be made on any attempted activity or transaction that the business has turned away, regardless of the amount of the transaction. A STR should also be made where an applicant for business or customer fails to provide adequate information or supporting evidence to verify his or her identity, or in the case of a legal person, the identity of any beneficial owner. The reporting officer also has an obligation under this section of the legislation. The reporting officer must, upon receipt of a report concerning a suspicious activity or transaction, investigate the details of such a report and determine whether or not to file an external STR with the agency. It should be noted that where the reporting officer makes a determination not to file a STR with the agency, this should be documented in the manner outlined in this section and be kept as part of their record-keeping requirements. If you need further guidance on how to write a SAR and what information should be submitted, there is further guidance available on the agency's website in this regard, and we would ask that you view this. Moving on to record-keeping requirements. Section 42 to 45 of the AML code outlines what a record of business would be required to keep, as well as the manner and form in which such records should be kept. It mentions that records should be easily retrievable, whether this be digitally or electronically, once it is made easily available to the agency or any other supervisory body promptly upon request. Records should be kept for a minimum of 5 years. However, the code doesn't mention specific situations where an entity might be required to keep records for a longer period of time. An example of this would be if a specific transaction or person is under investigation by the agency or any other supervisory body. The code also mentions the type of records an entity is required to keep. This includes a record of the business's policies, processes, and procedures as it relates to AML, CFT, CPF requirements. Additional record-keeping requirements can be found in the AML Regulations 2008 as amended. Training requirements. Section 47 and 48 outlines the training requirements for staff. Training is a very important factor in combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing within a business. For example, if employees are not sufficiently trained, they will not be able to forestall or detect any money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing red flags, which would prompt them to file a suspicious activity transaction report or know what customers, products, or services create a money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing risk to the business. For these reasons, the code requires that each employee of the business, including directors, seniors, key staff, temporary or contractual employees, be trained according to the appropriateness and level required by the AML regulations. For example, the MLRO would require specialized training as opposed to those persons that are considered to be key staff. In contrast, key staff would require more in-depth training than other employees that are not engaged in the day-to-day activities or transactions. Training should also be tailored to the employee's responsibility and be conducted at the appropriate level of detail. In addition to providing training, it is the responsibility of each business to have systems and procedures in place to test employees' understanding of the training given. So you cannot just issue training and not test whether or not the employee understands what is required of them. Having this testing mechanism in place will help to gauge the effectiveness of the training and would ensure better compliance from employees. The code further requires that training be conducted frequently and at a minimum of at least once a year. So I'll now pass it back to Mr. Hughes, who would wrap up this presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson-Hunt. To conclude, we would like to mention that various resources are available to assist jewelers, precious metals, and stones dealers to better understand their AML, CFT, and CPF obligations and how to implement the measures and policies required under the law. Now, this includes all of the legislation mentioned in this presentation, in addition to other documents. One document in particular will be the agency's guidance notes for high-value goods dealers, which include jewelers, precious metal, and stone dealers, which can be found on the agency's website. Now, the agency strives to work with its supervised entities to ensure that they understand the risks they face and the obligations and measures they are expected to implement. Now, while we can't specifically tell you or your business what to do, because the obligation ultimately remains with you to ensure the requirements are met, your assigned compliance examiner within the supervision and enforcement unit of the agency is always willing and able to provide support and guidance wherever possible. If you do not know who your named examiner is, you can always contact the unit to receive this information. So with that being said, this has brought us to the end of the presentation, and we will now answer any questions that you may have. We already have some coming, so we'll go ahead and answer the questions. This one says, if a customer is buying jewelry for more than $15,000 and sends the money via wire transfer from their home bank, should we report the same or no?
Okay, so we would assume that home bank could be in another jurisdiction or another country outside of the BVI. To answer this question, you are not required to immediately report this. As a business, you are required to perform a risk assessment of this customer, whether, if this money is coming from a high-risk country, a country that is subject to sanctions. You have to know where the money is coming from, and you also have to conduct due diligence on that customer. You have to know who that person is. If the person is residing here, you may ask, well, why are they sending the money from another bank outside of the jurisdiction that they are living in? it's just important that you conduct your due diligence on that customer. If after conducting your due diligence, and you see the need to make a report, you are to do so with your MLRO, and your MLRO should then make that report to the agency if there is any suspicion regarding that customer. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, another question that we have is, I'm a small business and some of the requirements to remain in compliance are a bit much. Why do I have to do this?
Okay. Good question. Thank you for that. We understand that these requirements can be a bit much. However, you need to bear in mind that not only are you protecting your business, but you're also protecting the BVI as a whole. So therefore, you would be required to undertake these requirements and adhere to these obligations. Yes.
Okay. Seems that we have no more questions, but if you do have any other questions, you can always refer those questions to the information provided on this slide, the email and phone number, and we will be happy to answer them. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the agency's webinar on AML, CFT, and CPF for jewelers, precious metal, and stone dealers. For the Financial Investigation Agency, I'm Timothy Hughes, Outreach Officer, and facilitating this webinar again was Natasha Jarvis and Siobhan Wilson Hunt. Thanks for watching.